So coming back to Romans, there are a number of large themes in this book. The one that we have been exploring, of course, is grace. In the first 3 chapters, Paul emphasizes grace, and now he is going to turn his attention thematically from grace to faith. Remember that Paul has been making the case about the guilt of all humankind. What he famously says is that all humankind falls short of the glory of God. And his emphasis, of course, was that both his people, Israel, and those who were known at the time as Gentiles, all fall short. That everyone is in need of God's grace. All people are culpable, all are responsible. Every single ancestor of Adam is accountable to God for the rebellion that happens in the garden and, of course, what we do ourselves. We fall short of the glory of God. The accusation and the accuser are both divine, that it is God that is wrong, that it is God that has been rebelled against. And because of that, it's a necessity that God do the forgiving, that God extend the mercy. Paul emphasizes that nothing that we can do is sufficient to cross that boundary, that nothing in us is good enough to be forgiven before God. So we have this dire situation, and into that dire, deadly situation, God extends his mercy and his grace to set the situation right. So that's the problem. The dilemma that we face is that we fall short of the glory of God. The answer to that is God's mercy, God's grace that comes into that life, into our lives. We define grace repeatedly as this unmerited favor. That is, that although you and I and every human being that we will ever lay eyes on bears the image of God within them, although that is a true statement, we are undeserving of God's favor because of the trail of rebellion that started in the garden. So those are the twin realities that we face. And so God looks into our situation, and he is merciful. He is merciful. He extends that in there into our lives. So that story of grace doesn't start there. That story of grace is all throughout the Bible, on every page and in every story and in every aspect of God's interaction with people. Grace is infused in all that. In all of that action. For you and I as Christians, the exemplar of grace, of course, is our Savior Jesus. And that verse from John chapter 3 that we recall so readily, that is really central to our understanding of God's mercy, of the grace that he shows, right? For God so loved the world, that he loves the world to such a degree that he gives his only begotten Son, so that whosoever shall believe will not perish, but have everlasting life. You like the way I wind together all those various Bible translations there. But the centerpiece of that whosoever shall believe, is central to where Paul is going to go in chapter 4. It draws our attention, as we turn in that chapter, to the necessity of faith. That is, God extends this mercy. He shows this incredible unmerited mercy to humankind, but it has to be apprehended. We have to accept it. God puts it out before us. He invites us to take it. He says, I'm showing you all this mercy. You, as Christians, saw this mercy in my Son on that cross. I'm giving it to you. No strings attached. But you have to take it. That's why there are equal parts mercy and invitation. You must take this and you must accept it by faith. And when we talk about faith, this is like grace, one of those things that we all understand. You all know what I'm talking about when I talk about faith. But just like grace, faith is also multifaceted. It has a number of components to it. It has a number of nuances to it that are easy to miss. But it's so important that we know what we're talking about. In the context of Romans, we tend to think of faith in terms of salvation. Faith leading to salvation. Faith sustaining us in that salvation. Faith where all the promises of God comes from. One of the things that is true about most Christians is that we see faith as having a very short history. That is, it comes from John 3:16 on. We see faith starting there. We tend to divide the Bible up. We take the clean part of the Bible, your Old Testament there, where you still have a lot of the gold leaf on there, and we say, well, that's a time of the law. And then we go over to the New Testament, the part that's much more worn off, and we say that's the time of grace and faith. But when we turn into chapter 4 today, something I want you to notice as we look at what Paul says is that that's not at all true. That faith marks the relationship between God and humankind from the first second that Adam pops out of the dirt. Faith is a necessary component of God's relationship with humankind throughout every bit of the Bible. And so keep that in mind as we turn in our Bibles to Romans chapter 4 and begin once again working through this book. Now, if you remember how chapter 3 ended months ago, Paul was engaged in this rhetorical argument. That is, he was posing questions that he himself was going to give the answer to. So you had to imagine this imaginary Jewish interlocutor, someone who was questioning him, who was peppering him with questions. And of course, Paul, being the genius that he is, he sets up his own questions to which he can give the answer to. That's genius, right? Because he's always going to have the right answer. And so this Jew would ask him a question that Paul would say, oh no, you're incorrect in your understanding. This is how it actually works. And at the tail end of chapter 3, from about verse 27 on to the end there, he's starting the transition. He's saying, the Jewish questioner is saying, well, what about works? It's necessary to do works. You have to do this. And Paul is saying, no, you're incorrect in your understanding. Your works are not what cements a relationship with God. They are not the binder of the covenant. It's your faith that is the binder of the covenant. And so he's made that back and forth at the tail end of chapter 3, then to jump in. And he's going to give an example that, again, is very familiar to us, but something that we might not see in the way that we normally do. So beginning in chapter 4, verse 1, what then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, discovered in this matter? Referring back to the end of chapter 3. If in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, Paul is digging all the way back to the beginning of the story. So let's go there. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 12. So let's see, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Genesis. Okay, Genesis chapter 12. Now, we often speak of our Hebrew brothers and sisters, of our God's people, Israel, right, as having these three fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yes? Okay? The people of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so we tend to think collectively of these men being the Hebrew nation. In Genesis chapter 12, we get our initial action introduction to Abram. Remember, he's Abram before he's Abraham. And this is famously where the Lord comes and says, hey, pack up your stuff. We're going on a little trip, right? The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. And then he gives him this beautiful promise that is you and I today. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, you guys have read this dozens of times. You're familiar with this. You didn't need me to read you this. You know how this story goes. He is obedient, and all of Israel decamps, and they go from Ur in the Chaldeans, wherever that might be, to some other location, right? Are we all on that track? Except there's one thing that we've missed. Brandy's holding her breath. I wanted to see how long it would go. There is one thing that we have missed, and it's this. There is no Israel. There are no Hebrews. Abram is a Gentile. Like you. Wait a second. This changes the nature of this story now. This is not God decamping his people. His people don't exist yet. What must Abram have in this obedience? He must have faith. You see, it's not his obedience that God blesses. It's not because he is ethnic Israel, and this is the point that Paul is making here. It's not because he's ethnic Israel. There is no ethnic Israel yet. It's not because of anything he does. It is because, contrary to what Adam and Eve showed in the garden, which was a lack of faith, God is going to assemble a people for himself. God is going to call those people out and bless them in a special way. But the first thing that must happen before that can occur is that Abram has to exercise faith. And that's the key to this story. That's the key to the blessing that will come after here. If Abram will exercise faith, then these blessings will become the reality that is you, my little shining stars. That's how this story goes. Of course, Paul is pulling from several chapters later when God makes a covenant with Abram. In chapter 15, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eleazar of Damascus? And Abram said, you have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. So he's testing the nature, the boundary of that faith. And then God says, watch this faith. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man that you think in your human actions is going to be your heir, this man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. Now, Put yourself in that place. Abram is like 1,000 years old, right? And his wife is 999 years old, or somewhere close to that. There is no conceivable human way that an heir is going to come out of that marriage and that union. And that's God's purpose. God is doing that by design. Once again, will you have faith in me? So God tells him what he's going to do. Test. Will you believe this? He took him outside, and he's pointing Abraham, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Now look at this line, 15 and 6. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. Now again, where is Israel at this time? There ain't no Israel. He's still a Gentile. And yet God has named him righteous. That's the point that Paul's making here. Because Paul is arguing with ethnic Jews who think that they are God's righteous people. They, by fact that they were born into that community, that they have some special relationship with God. And Paul is pointing them back to their own scriptures and saying, faith was a requirement before you became a people. In fact, they don't become a people until the external mark here in 17. But let's go back to Romans. So this is what Paul is saying. It is faith that named Abraham the father of God's people, and it is faith to the Gentiles that you're seeing exercised today. And so he continues with that argument in verse 4. Now to the one who works, wages are not credited as a gift, but as an obligation. So if you go to work, when you get your check, your boss is not giving you a gift. Your boss is giving you something that's due. So Paul is moving works out of this category. He said God would not respond to you with the gift of mercy. He would owe you mercy. So he's pushing it to the outer edges, saying that's impossible. However, to the one who does not work, in verse 5, but trusts God, who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness. David says the same thing when he speaks of the blessedness of the one to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Now, think about David for a second. We're moving from Abram to David, just jumping with Paul here. David is the man of God. David is the head of God's people, the leader, the blessed leader of God's people. And yet, what does he do? He sins. He falls badly. Peeks over the wall. Gets involved with that woman. Has her husband murdered. Just does all kind of vile things. If the relationship between God and God's people, and especially God's people's leader David, if that was based upon works, what could David possibly do? I mean, he's broken chief commandments in what he did there. You see, David wasn't works-oriented. David wasn't based upon tit for tat. David wasn't operating that way. David trusted that he was granted righteousness by his faith in God. Now, that doesn't mean that he escapes the consequences of his sin. We know all too well that David is going to have that, but look what he pulls here from Psalm 32. Blessed are those, this is the chief of sinners saying this. Blessed are those whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never, never count against him. That is so powerful. We say words like that amongst ourselves. It is a part of the things that we say in worship. That God forgets our sin. That God pushes our sin as far as the east is from the west. We say those things, but so many Christians don't internalize them. And it's a shame that this plain truth that Paul is making is bound up in such theologic complexity in this passage here. Here's the truth. All of God's mercy is yours by faith. By faith you received that mercy. By faith you became a part of the covenant community of God's people that Jesus confirmed. By faith you became a full member of the covenant with all the blessings and the hope that came with it. By faith. Not by anything that you did, not by anything that you are, completely by faith. Just like Abraham, when you believed, it was credited to you as righteousness. Done and done. Had nothing to do with our circumcision. It had nothing to do with anything external. It had nothing to do with getting in that tub. It had nothing to do with any action. When you believed, God credited the righteousness of Jesus Christ to your account. And it's done. He wrote it in pen. It is not going to be erased. It is not going to be moved. It is there forever. And this is the important thing. This is the point that Paul's making in all of this. God's mercy, God's righteousness that he grants to you does not waver back and forth. It doesn't roll back and forth according to your sin, to your rebellion, to your actions. That righteousness is yours. Period. End of statement. It is yours forever. And no sin, no matter how grievous, is going to remove that righteousness. Because you didn't earn it. You didn't do anything for it. You gained the righteousness of Christ solely by the mercy of God at the moment that you believed. Now, I know it's tempting to hear that as license. Like, ooh-wee, we can live however we want. No. Wrong. We must still confess. We must still be repentant. We must still seek out holiness. We must still do all that we can to not sin, to grow in that maturity. We'll still suffer the consequences of sin. We may still have some negative outcomes in life because of the bad rebellion that we've gotten ourselves in. But your standing as far as God is concerned does not change. That's a question that comes up all the time. Has my sin changed my relationship with God? As far as righteousness is concerned, no. No, absolutely not. You didn't do anything to earn it. You didn't do anything to get it. It was given to you by God. That means it is fixed by God. But here's the thing that does happen. Something we started to talk about in Sunday school. If we live this life of rebellion, if we allow this sin to foment in our life and to grow and to grow and to grow, it becomes this tar baby thing that we get attached to and we can't break away from it. And it gathers more and more stuff to it. And the net effect is not that your righteousness changes, but you grow this distance between yourself and God. You lose the intimacy of the presence of God. You don't recognize God as near in your heart. And here's the dangerous part. Once that starts to happen, once that distance starts to grow there, your longing for that to be corrected begins to recede as well. And then that distance grows a little more on your part, a little more on God's part. And it grows and it grows and it grows until one day sin has so consumed a person of God that they don't want the things of God. They lose the desire for those things. Has their righteousness changed? No. But their desire and all the promises that are theirs, the intimacy of God's presence in their life, that is what goes away. And that's what gives the people the impression that God has turned his back on them, that he has abandoned them. But that's not the God of the Bible. That's not the God of Scripture. And so Paul he's buried this truth. But if you look at verses 7 and 8 there in that passage, these are good things to underline, highlight them, memorize them, tattoo them on your arm, whatever you have to do. Bring these things to mind. Whenever there's that sense that there might be this growing distance between God and ourselves because of our sin, it may be just that reminder that if we throw ourselves on the mercy of God, that distance can begin to close up once again. So Paul concludes this part of the passage back in verse 9. Is this blessedness only for the circumcised, or also for the uncircumcised? Again, a rhetorical question. We've been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. And then, I threw the then in there, he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then he is the father of all who believed but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them. I know that Paul can be stilted in the way that he writes things, but there's an incredible promise in what he just said right there. There is no one excluded from this mercy, from this incredible blessing of faith. No one. No one, no matter what their ethnicity, the color of their skin, all the other dumb things that divide humankind. None of that stuff divides them. And those people that have buried the image of God beneath all kinds of trouble and the world and all that stuff, they too can know this kind of faith. And he is then also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but who also follow in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Now there is some deep theology there. And something that I'm still working out. And I don't know where you all land on this. But up until last week, I had a pretty firm division between Israel and the way that God dealt with Israel and the way that God dealt with people of the New Covenant, what we call the church. But the more that I meditate on faith, the more that I meditate on the truth of who Abram is, the more that I see that there is no hard break between Israel and God's people, the church. Because we're not people of the law, people of grace. We are all people of faith. So we'll talk about that some other time. It was faith that was disrupted in the garden, but it was also faith that began God's people, Israel. And in your life, in my life, and in all of our lives together, it was faith that brought us into the family of God's people. It's faith that we know all the blessings and the hope and the promises that come with being God's people. We all treasure the grace that came into our life by faith. It's by faith that we look at the myriad promises throughout the Bible, and we know that they are good and true, and that they are true in our lives. And it's by faith that we endure in this world. It's by faith that we trust what Paul will say later in chapter 8, that God takes all things, and works them for good. It's by faith that we carry on in a world that seems to be spinning out of control so often. It's by faith. And most importantly, it's by faith that you and I know that we're God's people. Father, Son, Spirit, that we're God's people, and God is ours. Amen?